welcome to the fourth program in our series, Reckoning, U.S. Presidents and Racial Inequality. I'm Robin von Seldeneck with the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library, and I will be moderating this evening's event. This series, which is possible thanks to the funding from the National Endowment for Humanities, explores individual presidents' views and political policies toward minority populations. We believe that these types of discussions among historians that include questions from the public are opportunities for honest conversation and reflection. We are indebted to our fellow presidential sites, such as the Hayes Presidential Library, who collaborate with us on these programs. If you are new to this series, I encourage you to visit presidentsandrace.org to view recordings of our Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and Ulysses S. Grant sessions. This evening, we will begin with a conversation with our panelists, followed by questions from the audience. We want to hear from you, so please use the Q&A button on your screen to type in any questions that you may have throughout this evening's event. At this time, I'm pleased to introduce this evening's panelist. First, Dr. Greg Downs is the professor of history at UC Davis and author of 3 books about Reconstruction and the Civil War era. Along with Kate Mazur, he co-wrote the National Park Service's first theme study of Reconstruction and helped historians' efforts to lobby for the creation of the first national park devoted to Reconstruction at Beaufort, South Carolina. He is the co-editor of the Journal of the Civil War Era. Also joining us this evening is Dustin McLochlin, who is the historian at the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museum. He authors a series of essays that can be found on the Hayes website that trace the evolution of Hayes' thoughts on slavery, race, and Reconstruction. Dustin received his PhD in political policy history from Bowling Green State University. Good evening, gentlemen. It's so nice to have you both with us today.
Nice to see you.
It's great to be here. Thank you for setting this up.
Well, you know, I think what I would like to do tonight, sometimes we start at the very beginning and who were they, when were they born, all of that great stuff. But I want to start this evening's conversation with a question about the 1876 presidential election. Why was this election so contentious? And why in the world did it become such a popular topic after the 2020 presidential election? And Greg, I'm going to ask you to comment on that first, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. And the only problem with it is it could be the only question we address because there are so many layers of it. And there are many reasons why people turn back toward the 1876 to 77 crisis, some of which were, well established. The reasons for thinking of its importance were well established long before the conflict over the outcome of the 2020 election. So for a long time, the historians and people more generally have been interested in the question of what happened to Reconstruction. As I think we'll go into in some follow-up questions, I'm not sure 1877 tells us as much as we think that it does about what happened to Reconstruction, but it's always been one of the key points people grab onto to say here was a movement that shared a lot with the civil rights movement of the 1950s, 1960s. In these decades right after the Civil War, where there's new constitutional amendments, a multitude of civil rights acts, and a vast expansion of African-American political participation. And what happened to it? And people have, because of the problem that people knew by the early 1900s, we had a South where the vast majority of African Americans are disfranchised and there's a system of segregation. People have long wondered when, where, why, what can we learn from it? In 1877, because of the very specific contours of what happened then, which I can come back to, has long been a place people have looked to for that answer. But it's also always been a place where a smaller group of people have looked to ask, does American democracy have the stability we think it has? Is it a system that can run of itself? And political theorists and historians and political scientists have long wrestled with the idea that Americans believe the American system can kind of run of itself. And yet there are all of these moments in forgotten history, especially in the 1800s, where that doesn't seem clearly true, where it seemed to wobble, where its legitimacy seemed really, or even survival seemed threatened. And 1877 is the one example of those that people know. There are others at different levels, but it's the one that people know because of what seemed like it's an anomaly of a undecided, seemingly undecided presidential election. And again, there are a lot of details here we can go into as well, and I'm glad to. Seemingly undecided presidential election in which both parties claim that a series of disputed state votes go in their direction and that fraud has either prevented them from winning or the combat against fraud is the reason why they should be declared the winner. And the gap in these states, 3 plus an additional state, 1 single state elector, is the margin, the balance in the presidential election under the Electoral College. So everything seems to sway on it. Enormous investment of time, effort, money by both parties to prove that they won those states. And contested electoral ballots coming to Washington while there are threats of civil war and a second civil war and uprisings. And in the face of this, then we get a true anomaly, the Electoral Commission, which is sort of invented on the fly, as a way of passing the buck and avoiding open conflict if Congress, if each House of Congress makes a different decision, that itself goes through its own backflips when one of its members has to leave. And so you get this sort of incredibly complicated, fraught series of fights over who's literally going to become the president, with this threat of fraud in the background, with this threat or claims of fraud, with this threat of violence. And quite a narrow escape, narrower than I think we sometimes, have always imagined, escape into a kind of stability with Hayes as president. The simultaneity of Hayes becoming president and 1877 seeming to represent an inflection point, maybe not quite a turning point, but an ebbing of Republican commitment to civil rights, makes it an almost irresistible story for joining these two pieces together. The American system was threatened, and the people sacrificed in order to preserve its stability were African Americans. In fact, the story is even more complicated and more confusing than that, and I'm going to be glad to go into it. But I think that those are, but for now, for the question you posed, I want to try and avoid some of the details of that until we get follow-up questions. And to say it's a conjoining place, and as we get for the question of civil rights and the question of whether American democracy actually can function and work and survive. It's not the only place for both of those, but it's a key place. And so over the last few years, as there was the ongoing question of whether the voting rights gains of the 1960s were in danger, there became this new appraisal of, maybe we could learn from what were the threats that were raised between the 1870s and the early 1900s that peeled away voting rights. And when you get the simultaneity of that with the attack upon the Capitol, something that did not happen in 1877, and the threat of contested election, and the incredible confusion over what Congress's role is, especially in the absence of any clarity provided by the solution to 1877, which was an electoral act that has, from the moment it was passed, confused everyone. It makes sense that 1877 can be this kind of touchstone. I think there are other places that we need to look as well, and I'll be glad to go into that. But it makes sense that it's sort of an irresistible moment to look back and say, is this a country wrestling with some of the same confluences that we see today? What do you think, Dustin?
Thank you. I was going to say, Dustin, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think I really appreciate that Professor Downs brings up the way that 2020 has brought this back into the attention of a lot of people. And I always found, and I'd love to hear Professor Downs talk about this, but I always have found the discrepancy between the way historians talk about this event and the way it's brought up in popular media, the vast difference in the way the two sides see this. I've always maybe I'm asking the question now to Professor Downs, but I've always been wondering why is there this disconnect? Why why do historians do not seem to have the effect on the narrative that is out there in the general public?
Yeah. Can I take that, or would you rather? Yeah.
I
That'd be a
think
good
that's
guess,
a
but-
fantastic question. I don't think we should wait for you to answer that one.
All right. I think that is a really great and troubling question, because it does raise the question of what if historians correct older errors and nobody cares. I have a sarcastic thing I sometimes say at history conferences about the zombies of Reconstruction. And I do think that there are certain things that have been killed in the historical and political science narrative and can't be killed in a more popular narrative, or even among non-specialist US historians, even among 20th century or 18th century historians. And several of these are really simple answers for why Reconstruction failed. They're different simple answers. And so one of these is 1877, right? I don't know if this is exactly what you're referring to, Dustin, but this belief that Hayes agreed to withdraw the troops and Reconstruction ended. Or sometimes, which is false, and which I'll go into, later. Or sometimes you'll see, all the troops left the South, which is not only false, but it's sort of absurd. Like, do people think there's no troops at Key West? It's ridiculous. But major historians over and over put this in their surveys. So it's not only the public's fault, historians get that wrong. Really basic things about that. But there's other zombies that stalk it. Pamela Brandwein, terrific political scientist, has gone after one, I think, really devastatingly. The idea that the courts, if it's not Hayes, then it must be the Supreme Court. And they'll point to specific Supreme Court cases, which are, by my lights, egregious and betrayals. But as if, then the gavel came down and it was over. And Professor Brandwein has really shown that in the complexity of how the federal court system worked, just like in the complexity of how, say, the military or the Justice Department worked, under the 1877 example, that in fact, there's all kinds of ways in which the courts continue to hear and to respond positively to cases. Those are bad moments, those Supreme Court decisions, but they're not endpoints. And there are other endpoints when we sort of need for this to be true. And I think it speaks to a real powerful need within American life, which is, if we recognize that Reconstruction was something good that went away, we have to deal with why. And we love simple answers, because a simple answer saves us from face a more searching answer. If the simple answer is there's one bad guy, it's Andrew Johnson, it's Rutherford B. Hayes, it's the people who voted yes on the Supreme Court. The answer isn't it's the American system, or that it was the popular will, or that it was all of these things that you study in your PhD, which is policies, which have all of these really important but hard to follow, and sometimes to outsiders unfairly boring bureaucratic aspects, right? Like, how does the Justice Department system of commissioners and marshals work? That's really confusing. Most scholars of the era can't explain that, but it matters. And saying the answer goes into those things about what are flaws in the American system, what was the popular will, and how do policy actually work, is a really discouraging thing, because it suggests that all of those things could repeat. If the problem is Andrew Johnson or Rutherford B. Hayes, all we have to do is make sure is no one clones them. But if the problem is that the system is the American political order itself has flaws that can be exploited, if the problem is that in a democracy, if people lose faith in racial engagement and racial equality, it's very hard to sustain through other ways. And if the problem is that you have to constantly pay attention to the seemingly mundane questions of policy that shape people's lives, then that suggests this could all happen again. And I think that part of the reason we look for myths is that we don't want to face that fact. And I think that it's much easier to have a scapegoat and to say it's that person's fault, not it's the fault of democracy, or the fault of the American system, or the fault of people, which includes many people among scholars who like high-minded phrases, but don't actually pay attention to the sort of nitty-gritty nuts and bolts of policy. So I don't know, can I ask you a question, Dustin? We're threatening to, do you feel like, what do you feel like people, well, I want to say walk in, but I know that is, more complicated in the pandemic, but when people come into the Hayes Library, which I do recommend You do, and I've done research there, and it's a really beautiful town as well. What do you think they show up assuming is true about Hayes and Reconstruction?
Well, I think it's what you pinpointed. They come in with the thought that that there was a contested election, that there was. I don't know that the general public understands the idea that there was a potential filibuster after electoral commission and all of those things. I think what they center in on is more that there was a backroom deal between nebulous politicians who had made this decision that, well, we've got to come to a conclusion to seat Hayes. And the way to do that is to give up everything in the South, like you mentioned, pull the troops from the South, end Reconstruction. So there's not a lot of thought, I guess, or maybe a lot of consideration with the number of states that had already gone through the readmission process, the redemption process, et cetera, and that there were a number of states that Hayes had to deal with, a number of considerations that he had to think about. It's more just there was a meeting in the Wormley Hotel, and there was that Hayes was seated, and in turn for that, we get Jim Crow laws. So I think that if it's sort of narrowed down to a specific idea, I think that is what people know about Hayes, just in general. So yeah, it's working against that narrative a little bit, but it's more about trying to bring up the nuance of the history and letting people come to a conclusion on their own. And that's what we attempt to do.
It's a great goal and a hard one. Is it worth us sort of quickly picking apart that what I think Dustin very well stated, the common narrative? Is it worth picking apart why that isn't true?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I know, years ago, people would even go so far as to say that, Hayes and a few key Republicans gave up the ability to defend African Americans so he could be president. I mean, it was that specific. And I think, that was actually one of the questions I was going to ask. So let's go ahead and get there.
You sure? I'm sorry, we're stepping on a really good list of questions. So I think, as I heard, Dustin narrate it, there are three, key parts of this. A, that there was a deal. B, that took, troops out of the South, and C, that ended Reconstruction. And I would say, A, that there was a deal is debatable, in that historians of goodwill come to some different conclusions. B, that it took troops out of the South is not only false, but obviously false. C, that it ended Reconstruction is something that I would say that my opinion is that the vast majority of historians would disagree with. Right. So it's, not that it's wrong in one respect, but that it's wrong in many respects. And so that makes it more interesting than if it's just an error, but it might also show why it's so hard to undo. So the deal. I mean, I think this is classic Americana. The problem is a few nefarious politicians who thwarted the good people. Well, that's a sort of cop-out if I've ever heard one. The amount of energy that Americans, including American historians, spend in trying to save people from the idea that some of the most nefarious things in American history were popular and were produced by democracy is staggering, right? So A majority of voters by the popular vote voted for Sam Tilden, whose whole platform was destroying Reconstruction. So if your argument is, if someone's argument is that a small number of politicians undid it, there's an immediate thing to sort of wrestle with, right? That the Democrats had always promised to undo it. Tilden continued that promise, maybe a little bit less vociferously than some prior Democrats, but everyone knew a vote for Tilden was the end of Reconstruction, as much as a president could possibly do it, not just in the question of troops that'll come up. Was there a deal? So this goes to some really arcane questions about how filibustering worked in the 1870s, which is totally different than how it worked now in terms of there's some basic variances of how, you could delay votes in the House and the Senate. So now we assume filibusters shape the Senate and not the House. In much of the 19th century, the assumption is actually the opposite. The House is more shaped by filibusters until it's killed. So there's a question the only question that really sits on the table by the time people meet in the Wormley Hotel, at least as I understand it, but there's a lot that's been written on this, is is it possible to avoid the two houses failing to come to agreement or going out of session? What if there is no president named by inauguration day? And this does involve a series of deals, agreements, basically, to agree to end debate. And it is clear at this point that people understand that what a series of Southern Democrats are getting in exchange for accepting ending debate is some say in Hayes policies, especially as it relates to the post office, which is, again, super boring from the outside, but it really matters because the president at the time, that was one thing the president could control. Who's the postmaster? And Republicans appointed Black postmasters, and they appointed white men who appointed Black assistant postmasters in these towns. And Democrats were committed to that being zero. They cared a lot about the postmaster. On the troops in the South, the next part, it's hard for me to understand the argument that there was a deal because it had been part of the Republican platform, that narrowly what happened was in fact part of the Republican platform. So it wasn't some secret promise made. The Republicans had said, and Hayes had said, that their goal was to avoid propping up state governments in the South. Number two, do soldiers actually leave as part of this deal? They do, but not in the way that people think. In Louisiana and in South Carolina, people have invaded the legislature multiple times in Louisiana in order to lock out Republicans in the biracial legislature and to declare basically what we might see as illegitimate or rump legislators. The U.S. Army had gone into the Louisiana legislature more than once in order to chase out these people who broke in and to allow what they believed was the regularly constituted legislature to hold order. But this is a big issue. If I live in California, if the Army was marching into the state capitol in Sacramento to kick people out of the legislative hall, people would understand it was a big deal. It was, as General Sheridan, who is sent down to investigate in Louisiana, what he presents as the only option. If the other side is going to try and overthrow the legislature by force, there had to be some counterforce that could protect it. But this is highly controversial, depends on a kind of claim of military authority that's hard to sustain and what they saw as peacetime. The answer Grant saw was say it's not peacetime and extend the potential for martial law over a number of states in 1876. That actually passes one house of Congress in early 1876, but dies in the other. So that's taken away. And so now the question lies throughout 1876, will Republicans keep doing this? Hayes comes out of a wing that says it's not sustainable. From my perspective, that's a really flawed position, but it's a position you can arrive at out of constitutional principles, not out of racial animus or betrayal. Like I said, it's hard to imagine circumstances where everyone would be happy with the legislature being taken over by the Army in any circumstances except the single most extreme. To me, these are the single most extreme, but I do believe Hayes could arrive at it without being driven by racial animus. That's what he acknowledges that he has already said publicly, or what his supporters acknowledge what he has already said publicly, that he will have his troops not leave, or the US troops not leave the South, but march a few blocks. They go from where the legislature meets to their barracks. That's a big deal, but it's not leaving the South. And in fact, the US Army remains in the South and will continue to be called out, at various times from the 1870s to the early 1890s, but for a different reason, to enforce judicial orders on voting rights. And there's a whole big fight about how Hayes defends the Army and its role in the South in 1878 to 1880 that we can go into later. So it doesn't withdraw the Army. It's not much of a deal if you say, I'm going to do what I already said I would do. It's not withdrawing from the South. And I think the vast majority of scholars, to my belief, that we haven't done an official poll, no longer believe that 1876, for these reasons, is the end of Reconstruction, much less the official end. If Reconstruction is the Army running governments in the South, that ends in 1871. And so it doesn't make any sense. 1876 isn't the answer to that question. If that ends, when we see the rollback of voting rights in the South, that really ends in the 1890s. When you get the movement after the failure of the Election Act in 1890 to 91 by Southern states to move toward disfranchisement, not just toward white control of state governments, but toward disfranchisement, and the Supreme Court's acquiescence to that in Williams v. Mississippi. So that's 1876 is too late to be when military control ends, and 20 years too early to be when voting ends. And if you trace other questions about Reconstruction, you're also going to end up with some answers that are earlier. John Fabian Witt, distinguished legal scholar, says 1868 might be a good answer, and some answers that are a little bit later, in the early 1900s. But the answer that gets you to 1877 is, to me, not a very strong answer for what Reconstruction was. It is, do Republicans hold the governorship of Southern states? It's not, are there Black elected officials? That goes longer. It's not, are there, Republican successes? That goes longer. It's not, can the military run the state? That's been over for years. To me, Reconstruction cannot be just simply whether there are Republican governors. And in fact, North Carolina has a Republican governor in the 1890s. And we acknowledge that there's something going on there that is ended by Reconstruction and the white supremacy campaigns. So that's why I find it a particularly unconvincing argument. Though the details, there's room for principal disagreement on exactly how much what happens in the Wormley Hotel was known and how important it is. And I would say scholars do, to those few scholars who look at that narrowly, do disagree on that.
Well, Greg, if I were just listening to you, I get the impression that sometimes historians don't agree on everything, right? I think people need to hear that. There are so many different ways that we are able to look at a topic, and there's a lot of disagreement. And I think that's an important piece to bring up. So I did want to mention that, because, it's not a clean, the study of history is not easy and clean. It's difficult, it's dirty, and getting into the nitty gritty of what it's really about. So I also want to thank you guys for continuing on. I don't know what just happened in Stanton, but we had some sort of power surge. And
Oh,
so
no.
I think Andrew and I both just disappeared, but thank you so much for continuing. So
I thought you didn't walk out. You were like, it is 1877. I'm out of here. I can't be part of this.
I disagree so much. I'm out of here. No, seriously. I do want to go back a little bit here and just hear a little bit more about who Hayes was as a person, who he was as an individual. And Dustin, I know, I think, in chatting with you, you brought up a very valid point that to understand Hayes of the 1870s, you got to go back to the 1850s. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more for us so we get a better understanding of who in the world this man was?
Yeah, Hayes was not. He was anti-abolitionist as a young man. He had an uncle who was raising him and influenced him quite a bit in that role. Even into his college years and into his time at Harvard, he was commenting negatively about John Quincy Adams's views on slavery. It's not until the 1850s when you start to, into the 1840s and 1850s, when you see a switch in the way he's thinking about things. And he's working in Cincinnati as a lawyer, and he's coming into contact with the famous abolitionists there who are lawyers and defending fugitive or freedom seekers. And on multiple occasions, we know of two in particular, he does defend freedom seekers who are in the court system. In one situation, there was a man named Lewis who actually decides to escape the courtroom in the midst of the case. And another, he defends a young girl named Rosetta, who was being transported through Ohio. And of course, that gets into questions of when does she become free upon entering that free state, which is a whole legal argument. I'm sure Professor Downs could go into quite some detail. But throughout the 1850s, and as you get into the 1860s, of course, you see in the way that he's talking about slavery, it's a very different different response than you would have heard from him as a younger man, especially as he comes across what were called contraband slaves in the Civil War. His journal entries become much more anti-slavery than you've seen at any point in his life. As he goes into Congress, he sides with the radical Republicans. His first run as governor of Ohio, he's clearly on a radical Republican plank there. So yeah, this change, and I think I'm going to probably just ping pong this over to Dr. Downs on this, because I've always been interested in the fact that as we get into 1872, and you see that liberal Republican revolt against Grant, Hayes stays loyal to the Republican Party, but the men who orchestrated a lot of that become very important in his cabinet and his political outlook in 76. So I guess I'm curious, as we get into that early 70s into the mid 70s, I think Professor Downs, at one point you said he's a normal Republican, and I'm just kind of curious what happens there in the 70s that this different way of looking at it kind of happens.
Well, that's a great question, because you're right. I do say that, and yet you're right that saying he's a normal Republican does, I think, help us capture the things you very ably described, his 1850s, 1860s beliefs and transformations. And it doesn't really prepare us for what happens when those normal Republicans fracture in the 1870s and what his role is. So, I think because people can confound, the sort of question of what happens in 1877. If you take a skeptical view of Hayes, you can look to read backwards for signs that he never cared about slavery or civil rights. And as you point out, that's simply not true. And the story of how he comes to care and how he learns is really interesting. But it does clearly show that he's around a lot of people. I mean, Salmon Chase, right, who become iconic in the Republican Party and not as moderates or centrists even within the Republican Party. And that the things that united that party, right? This is a new party, right? It didn't exist. And 6 years later, it wins the White House, right? So they're desperate to articulate during this period, and Chase is one of those key figures, to articulate what holds Republicans together. And one is a sort of belief that slavery is wrong and must not be extended. What else is a much bigger question that the war peels open, right? The second of which is that there are, especially powerful among the legal members of the community, are that while there is constitutional justification for some form of fugitive slave act, that people have basic rights to access to court that the Fugitive Slave Right Act of 1850 is denying them. And this procedural claims about how people should be able to be heard. And then, and a belief that the Southern slaveholding states are exercising far too much power. And even moderate Republicans or conservative Republicans tend to hold these sets of views. In that world, you can get people who are, what we might call anti-racist, and lots of people who we would call, racist of different stripes. The belief in equality, especially if we're thinking about human equality beyond just access to the law or access to politics, there's a lot more argument. But Hayes is clearly one of these people moving in these lines. And if you didn't like that viewpoint, you didn't have to look for a Republican who might say something a little mealy-mouthed. There's a whole political party, the oldest political party in the US, the Democrats, who are spending their whole time saying, we will never do those things. Right? So you don't have to, look for a conservative Republican if your goal is to block some kind of civil rights. The Democrats are always promising that. And the people who are Republicans and choose to be are dissenting from the party that had dominated the 1850s, the Democrats. And that tells us something. But with emancipation, once you succeed in a certain set of goals, right? Emancipation wasn't a goal for all of them, or except in a very distant way. But it was what unified a lot of the beliefs that held the Republican Party together. The Republican Party holds together through some pretty momentous things in the 1860s, not just the Civil War, but the Confiscation Acts, the Emancipation, the Emancipation Amendment in the 13th, the 14th Amendment, that establishes birthright citizenship, due process, equal protection, and a number of civil rights acts with very marginal fights, over exactly what the content of some of these will be. And then the 15th Amendment. But once you get that accomplished, that you build in these protections, you take away some of these race-based exclusions, you build in some of these at least abstract defenses of rights. What next? That becomes something that's a much harder question. Why? Because that wasn't what held the Republican Party together. They had a common enemy and a common goal. They defeated that enemy, they achieved that goal, and then they realized all the things that they hadn't been able to fight about because those things weren't on the table. And it's the problems of victory and the problems of success. The Republicans included people who shared those common beliefs, but were what we might call big government, many of them coming out of Whigs and believing in very activist federal government in lots of things. They also included people who who believed the problem with slavery is it created big government, and that you could critique slavery as an extension of government that needed to be peeled back. Many of those came out of, Democratic Party or Free Soil and other areas, as well as people who had very different views on all kinds of other issues. The tariff, this is why it's so bizarre when people say the Civil War is about the tariff, right? The Republicans disagreed on the tariff all the time. They didn't disagree on the question of should slavery be extended, right? And should it be protected in every possible way? So as these other issues start to rise over the 1860s and to take center stage, they always exist even in the war, but they take secondary role because of the centrality of emancipation, the balance of political power, and the establishment of at least certain basic rights on paper. As those get accomplished, these other divisions manifest. And some of them manifest around how far to go in civil rights. There's a whole group of people who become very wary with where civil rights protection is going. Some of them because they never believed in equality or in political rights. Others because they never believed in the military. So among the people who join with, some liberal causes are people like Charles Sumner, who's a lifelong advocate of civil rights, a hero of the civil rights movement, but also a lifelong person who's skeptical of the military. And when equal rights becomes dependent on military enforcement, Sumner gets very nervous. For this, Frederick Douglass scolds Sumner, saying he's putting principles over his commitment to racial equality. If government requires force to have equality, you have to choose. And he argues Sumner chooses, his commitment to resisting governmental force over his commitment to equality. That's one of the things brewing that helps to create this group of discontented Republicans. How much military do you use in the Ku Klux Klan Act? How much military do you use once states have been restored to Congress and formal peace is at hand? How much are you changing the permanent system of government, not just fighting a war? The other goes to a set of correlated issues, which is an argument that the Grant administration is not only overreaching in its use of the Army, it's also overreaching or taking too much personal control that feeds into a narrative of corruption. And so many of these reformers come together on an idea that the power of the military has fed into a corruption of government under Grant. Grant, as a non-politician, had been bought out by the politicians or by other interests in their view. And the Southern state governments that were elected under military protection themselves, they argue, are corrupt in the ways they're issuing bonds. Historians are very wary of these claims because corruption of the type people are talking about, which is of bond holding as expand too much bonds, is a very normal part of 19th century American life. And many democratic governments have done exactly the same thing, issuing too many bonds. Historians are also wary of the idea that personal corruption, which is certainly there around the Grant administration, is unusual or unique to either the Grant administration or to the Reconstruction governments in the South. But it becomes a way of binding together these groups. And so that helps to create the capital L liberal Republican exodus from the party that goes so far as to leave the party and ends up in a sort of, a complicated embrace of some Democrats in 1872 that fails. As you say, Hayes is part of the group of people who's seen as sympathetic to their ideas, but unwilling to leave the party. 1876, Republicans are now looking at, they're going to run without Grant. How do they win? They can't pick a liberal Republican because the real Republicans will hate them and they'll never be considered trustworthy on civil rights. But if they pick a successor to the Grant administration, it'll be seen as sort of open to this corruption argument. And Hayes, along with a handful of other people, Benjamin Bristow and others, represent this sort of uneasy way of trying to balance the two, more so than Bristow he does, of trying to hold the party together and yet acknowledge the utility of liberal complaints. And so that's part of what I think helps him to navigate this. It's not that he's acceptable to everybody, because some people are really worked up about it. It's that he's less unacceptable to lots of people, right? There's a lot of people that groups want to strike. You need a supermajority at the time to be nominated in the convention. And Hayes is less unacceptable to more people in a party that really can't bring itself together and win what it knows is going to be a very contested election.
I want to, if it's okay, we have 3 questions coming in that I want to make sure we get to, and then I want to make sure we have time to talk a little bit about Hayes and Native Americans and also the Chinese Exclusion Act. So the 3 questions, the first one is, looking back at 1876, were the issues basically the same in each of the contested states, or were there various issues that were being debated in that election?
Yeah, so there's always some, local context, but at heart, the 3 states that are, Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, are rooted in a common set of challenges, which is that in areas that have both a significant Black population and a significant white population, there is widespread evidence of fraud by white Democrats, of stuffing ballot boxes, and of intimidation. This poses real problems with counting the votes. Democrat, which is that if you get a county that has a large Black population and you get no Republican votes, it's pretty clear something funny has happened. But what do you do about it? How do you rectify that? And, this, is stymies until, a bunch of Southern governments until Democrats take over and are like, what you do about it is celebrate, right? And so you have Republican governments that are looking at this question. How do you respond to that? Democrats in turn charge that if you don't accept these returns, then you're corrupt. And so there's these back and forth charges. There is a 20th elector out of Oregon that's a completely different set of issues, which is about whether the person had held a federal office and was ineligible to be a presidential elector. And that is sort of put in to sort of even add to the complexity of it. But what do you think, Dustin?
Yeah, and I guess the only thing I would add to it is that maybe the differences between the outcomes in South Carolina and Florida versus Louisiana. It seemed as if the majority of Americans and Hayes and Republicans and everyone understood that Louisiana was the real battleground. It was the one where there was the greatest discrepancy in the outcome, as well as with just the history that Louisiana had of contested elections in the past. So that's the only addition I would add to what you responded with.
Okay, the second question goes back to talking about the deal that was happening. If there was not really a deal, then why did Tilden agree to allow Hayes to be president? What was happening there?
Well, there's a bunch of things that come up with this, including the character of Sam Tilden. So Henry Watterson, who becomes a truly, monumental for a while figure in the post-Civil War South, and is at the time a congressman, newspaper publisher in Louisville, and becomes a sort of ambassador between congressional Democrats and Tilden. And Watterson says, and he's an exaggerator, but it's not implausible, that he goes up to Gramercy Park, where Tilden lives, on the edge of this sort of, still gated and private park within the city of New York, of Manhattan, that you have to have a special key to get in, and a double wide mansion that faces it. Tilden's one of the richest people in New York City and has a mansion to show that's now the National Arts Club. And he tells Tilden, if you press it, you'll win. And he says, but you're going to have to press it. You're going to have to go to DC and challenge them and say, I dare you not to inaugurate. He says, I might be getting some of the details wrong, that he spends a day with Tilden, during which Tilden is having a massage when he arrives. They then have a gargantuan feast. And then Tilden has his post-lunch massage. And he claims that he tells a friend in Congress, no man who needs 2 massages in a day is going to be willing to go to jail to be president. His argument is Tilden has already surrendered. And none of that was on the table at the Wormley Hotel. And the Republicans knew it. And that Tilden had always sort of expressed an interest in being president, but an unwillingness to force this. In fact, there were a number of Democrats angling. The part that gives Watterson some credence is that the Democratic governor of New York had replaced the head of the state militia with George McClellan explicitly so that McClellan could become charge of a group of Democratic militias to go into DC and demand that Tilden be inaugurated. And governors in surrounding states, Maryland, Virginia, Democratic governors had also expressed a willingness to use their militia, but only to support Tilden, not to just run up there at no difference. And once Tilden becomes clear that Tilden's not going to do that, which people know, well before the Wormley meeting, the Democrats are playing a losing hand. Now, Watterson's, loved personal explanations of people's foibles, but it does seem like it captures Sam Tilden needed to be rich. It's not clear that he needed personally to be president.
Yeah, maybe you have it memorized, but in his concession statement, he says, I'm happy that I was elected president, but don't actually have to take the job.
That's a great line. I don't have it memorized, but that's a great line.
That's great. Okay. Well, another question. Is it accurate that Democrats had won control of Congress by 1876 and then cut the funding for troops in the South because they viewed it as an occupying force that people no longer wanted to support?
Almost. It becomes accurate. So Democrats in the 1874 election win control of the House of Representatives, and they immediately go to war against Reconstruction. I had a slight, time error. So it's in that what's called the lame duck session of November 1874 to March 1875 that Grant pushes for one last act to expand martial law over Louisiana and other states, not early 1876, as I said. Everybody knows that when Congress returns in late 1875, Democrats will have the House. They're already threatening to impeach Grant, which is part of why Grant backs away over 1876. The Democrats win in part because of the panic of 1873 economic downturn, in part because of this, public turn away from support for Reconstruction, especially as, you get more and more of these sort of very visible efforts. But because Senate elections are staggered, Republicans do terribly in 1874, but they hold the Senate because they had such a large majority. That creates a series of extraordinary tie-ups in the first years of Hayes's election, of Hayes's term, until the Democrats finally do gain control of the Senate and have this brief window of control of both, after the election of 1878. And it's in this period where Congress goes to war with itself, where the Democrats in the House try and trash the Army to cut it dramatically from what was already pretty low levels and to destroy the Army budget. The Republican Senate refuses to. There's a year where the Army is not paid. They're paid in scrip, IOUs, because Democrats won't pass any Army budget that doesn't include destruction of the Army. When they gain control, they try and there's basically a governmental shutdown over 1879 to 80. I think the number is 5, but I bet Dustin has it to memory, that 5 times they pass budgets that either dramatically reduce the Army or that include these riders that prevent the Army from carrying out orders in the South. Hayes vetoes it 5 times. He said it is to the victor to determine the terms of victory. When they finally do pass a budget, it is because the Democrats essentially accept a symbolic claim that the Army can't do anything that's unconstitutional. This is the Posse Comitatus rider, which really nobody thinks means anything until the Army revives it in the 1970s as a way to get out of being called to enforce the drug war. And since then, it's become a huge deal. But it certainly doesn't restrain the carrying out of federal court orders, as Eisenhower showed in Little Rock and Kennedy showed in Oxford, Mississippi, among others. So, there's very clear that a Democratic goal doesn't end with Hayes. Their goal is to destroy the Army, which raises then problems of how they're going to keep, and what saves the Army, ironically, are Texas Democrats who want to preserve enough Army to fight the Comanche and to defect from the party stance because they're worried that weakening the Army too much will open up Central and West Texas to more Comanche raids. So there's no question that Democrats don't see 1877 as a victory lap. It's a prelude to what would really matter, which is ensuring that the Army can never be used again in this way, even to carry out a judge's order.
Great. I really am going to get to those two other topics, but another question came in that I do want to hit right now, and that is, how did Hayes's experiences in the Civil War, including several battles here in the Shenandoah Valley, shape his views of leadership and governance, as well as his outlook on slavery, having seen the evils and the effects of that firsthand?
Why don't you take that first, Dr. McLochlin?
Well, as far as I can answer it, I feel like I'd already hit on it. The way that you can see this in Hayes's journals, I think this is the one thing that really comes out in his Civil War writings is when he starts to see the effects of contraband slaves making his way into his regiment, sending them north. Lucy's writing to him, telling him, "Do not send any slaves back south." And after this moment, especially into 1862 into 63. His writings become much more staunchly anti-slavery. He actually calls out people like William Tecumseh Sherman for being not strong enough. And we got to be careful of these people after the war, that they can't control the Army because they don't understand that the real issue here is slavery. And so I unquestionably think that becomes a part of him. And when he, as far as into the Shenandoah Valley, he's there finally sort of getting his exposure to the big time of the war, after spending so much time in West Virginia, or what would become West Virginia. And then after the war, he starts to, like I said, once he runs for the Congress seat and takes his seat there, he doesn't necessarily become a radical Republican, but he becomes a supporter of the radical Republicans. He writes in his journal about how his children are just hanging on every word of Thaddeus Stevens and talking about how much he appreciated him. So he becomes an ally to that. And like I said, as he moves into the Congress or to the governorship in Ohio, he's pushing for these amendments to be pushed through. And so, I think the Civil War had a massive effect on him going forward.
Professor Downs, anything you'd like to
share? I like it. I think that's a great answer.
Okay. All right. So now we're getting there. Hayes' presidency, I think if you look, brings change in a federal Indian policy as the government moves away from forced removal of Indians from or Native Americans, from reservations. How did that policy evolve? What were Hayes' personal views on Native Americans?
I think since you did so well, do you want to start us on the question, Dr. McLochlin, and I'll come in because I have some ideas. But I remember even years ago when I was last there that this was something you all were already working toward displaying.
Yeah, it's hard to really pin Hayes down here on this. He says a lot of things that puts him into the time. He refers to people of other races that aren't white as the weaker races a lot, and that's part of the language that he's using. As far as with the Indian policy, his ideas are not ideas that we might think are very progressive today. But at the time, he thought they were, and a lot of Republicans thought they were. He felt that to bring Native Americans into white society was the way to go, to work away from communal ownership of land into individual ownership of land, white education, Christian education, taking young Native American children and putting them into boarding schools. He opened schools, or he had a hand in opening schools in Pennsylvania and Oregon. It was for one particular instance towards the throughout his presidency, dealing with the Ponca Indians, you can see a real struggle with him about, okay, there were Ponca Indians that were being encroached upon on their lands, and where should they go? Should they go to Indian territory? Should they go to their native accompanying territory up in Nebraska? And Hayes leaves a lot of these decisions to his Interior Secretary, Carl Schurz, but he struggles with the decisions that are made as they're moved to the Indian Territory, as they ask to come back. Schurz saying no, Hayes wondering why, and all these questions. And towards the end of his presidency, he actually asks for reparations for those who had been removed. And he asked for Indians, Native Americans, to have access to the lands that they want to choose, with the idea that they could have a time where white encroachment could not occur for them. But in the end, it was all sort of pushed forward by this concept of Native Americans need to find a way to become more American. And I think that is an underlying part of what he's pushing for.
And I think, you're discussing something that we've talked about in earlier episodes of this series, of that very paternalistic view of to be able to assimilate and be seen as the white European. You've got to be, what is our concept of civilized, the Christian faith? How do we indoctrinate these Native people so that they're more like the European Americans who are here? And so that's something that we see continuing as we've talked about this in earlier episodes of this series. So, Dr. Downs, anything you'd like to add on that? And you're on mute. Sorry.
Probably the best I ever said. If I just had that one line back, I think that's really well said, and I don't have much to add to it. Except as a way of helping, people contextualize how is it that someone could be a reformer and see themselves as a reformer and still be embedded in what seems to us pretty clearly a kind of paternalistic, racism, right? Which is what we see, this sort of civilization or assimilation rhetoric is really drawing from, right? An assumption that Native people are not, equal in their current state, but could become equal if they can live more like white people. And how is it possible to say that he's both of those things? And I think it goes to the question of broader public opinion, that there remains, large sections of the public who were, were looking for candidates as close as they could get toward exterminationist. And that it's clear in state level elections, especially in places where there are, ongoing sites of engagement between settlers moving into native land, that white settlers will often vote for people who call for outright extermination and extinction as a policy. It's in that context that reform emerges, as a way not only of saying there's another way than extinction, but also that extinction is rooted in the idea of completely fixed differences. That isn't true. Now, their answer for why it's not true is they say the differences are rooted in culture and lifestyle, and so there's not equality, but there's a potential equality that's rooted in mirroring themselves after white people. From our perspective, the racism of that is obvious, and it was obvious to some of the people in the 1870s as well. But to counter people who claimed either permanent inferiority or who celebrated extermination, you can understand how that could both be, paternalistic and racist, and also be a reform position compared to that. Now you may be muted.
There we go. My computer is just not wanting to play well tonight. I think that my computer might be telling me I shouldn't talk because it was not unmuting me. I briefly want to ask if I'm going to let the two of you decide who wants to go first. Just a little background on the Chinese Exclusion Act and why did Hayes ultimately veto that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll try and do it quickly because I know we've got other questions. It's really interesting. And in fact, there's some really incredible work that's been going on in the historical field over the relationship between American views of Chinese migrants, American relations with China, and the questions of Reconstruction. So it's a really sort of exciting place where historians have learned a lot, thanks to a number of really powerful recent works. One I'll mention is by Beth Lou Williams. The questions, so the way that I would say it is that to understand the question of Chinese migration, we have to, and the impact it has on politics, we have to have a few things in mind at the same time that are hard to keep in mind. One of which is that some Republicans who were very committed to the equality of Black people were not at all committed to the equality of other racial groups. Some of these had a kind of frankly Protestant vision that Protestants could be equal and no one else. So some of them, in fact, cheerfully say that Black people should be equal because they're Protestants on the whole, unlike Catholic immigrants from Europe, who we would see as white and say, how can they be, sort of messing this up? And non-Protestants in natives and Asians. So there's a group of Republicans who have always said, really the whole point of the 14th and 15th Amendment was to enfranchise Black people. We had to write it more broadly, but we know what that means. And while we might be tempted to say, see, those people didn't really believe, some of those people are the people most committed to Black rights. It's just part of the sort of shift. They thought of things, some of them are what we call have multivalent forms of racism rather than a continuum of, sort of less racist, more racist. This gets especially powerful in something else that's hard to keep in mind, which is regional differentiation. West Coast Republicans go crazy over Chinese migration because large numbers of Chinese people are moving in from the very early 1850s, some in, slightly before that, but large numbers of people are moving in there. That creates a massive backlash among white Westerners. Many of whom are looking for candidates who will promise to stop what they see as competition. That's lowering the sort of value of white labor because there's now a larger labor pool to compete with, as well as all of these prejudices specifically against Chinese and more generally against Asians. Huge issue in the West. For a while, some Republicans try and modulate this and they lose. By the 1870s, California and other Western Republicans are saying the only way, this again seems crazy to us, but the only way to protect African-American rights is to separate them from Chinese rights, because that's a loser in the West, right? Relatively small African-American population in a place like California, quite large Chinese population. You can sell doing things for the tiny group of African-Americans, but it's a much harder political swim when the Democrats are running about exclusion. So that's an issue. The Republicans in the East, by and large, aren't worked up about this, in part maybe because they're better people, but maybe also because there's very few Chinese people there. So Western governments are passing all kinds of local laws and state laws. And that hits the third issue, which is what power does the White House have? Not a lot in the 19th century, but Hayes argued they are the ones who make deals with other governments. The Senate ratifies them. So Hayes, isn't that committed to, he doesn't come out of a part of the party that's interested in anti-Chinese legislation. It's just not on the agenda, until they have to deal with it from these Republicans who'll vote for some things they want, but want in return a, caving on, a turn against Chinese migration from the West. But he does believe that the president has this power over treaties. When Congress is abrogating what he sees as the Burlingame Treaty that establishes in 1867 the relationship between the government of China and the government of the US. He basically says, if you pressure me, we'll start making a different treaty with China, but the Congress can't take over the treaty-making power. So it's some combination, and I'd be curious how you all portray this, Dr. McLochlin, at the site, of not being an issue. He was not, to my knowledge, motivated by anti-Chinese sentiment to the degree he thought about it. And he was motivated by a belief in defending the prerogatives of the White House that lead him to this double act of vetoing, but starting the process of making a treaty with the Chinese government that does eventually help to pave the way for the Exclusion Act that is passed and signed in 1882.
Yeah, I guess the insight that I could bring to answer your question that you pose is that Hayes was not interested, like you said, and there was a lot of his advisors were talking about how this would upset trade and how this would upset, like you mentioned, the Burlingame Treaty. It wasn't necessarily about the labor issue for him. But he does say, and he does comment in his writings that he sees Chinese migration as an invasion, and it's because Chinese immigrants are mostly coming over as men, taking jobs and sending money back home. They're not bringing their families. It's not immigration in the way that he views immigration should be. So I think that, to your second point, I think that's what informs his desire to not necessarily kill it, but at the same time veto it for those other reasons.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Mm-hmm. Well, I apologize. We are going a little bit over. I hope that's okay. So I'm just going to ask two more questions, and then I hope that's okay with everyone. One question is, I think this is a very important question, because often when we think of Hayes, we think of the railroad strike. So I'm going to start with you, Dustin, to comment on the railroad strike of 1877. Hayes uses the U.S. Army. Give us a little background on that, and then.
Well, what I think is interesting about this particular strike is that just to go back to the Reconstruction issue a little bit, it tells us a little bit about his thinking about what the role of the federal government was. You know, the railroad strike was taking place over multiple states. He was not necessarily against the right to strike, but he was constantly writing about how he wanted to protect private property. In the end, just to cut to the chase, he essentially breaks the strike. He even writes it in his journal, "I broke the strike by force." But where it's really interesting when we talk about his views on government is he sees it as, I cannot go in there unless the state governments request it. So he's waiting for the proper request so that he can then move in with troops to help protect property, however you want to put it. But he has this idea of his view of where the powers of the federal government and the state governments lie. And I think that tells us a little bit about how he's viewing Reconstruction as well, and what the role of the government is in the South. And I'll pass it off to you.
No, I think that's a great way of putting it. Sometimes it is portrayed, and there's some basis for this, but not in the way that people absorb it, as if he chooses, his choice is to give up on Reconstruction in order to make sure to destroy labor, and that's certainly a very appealing. I mean, it's an unappealing narrative, but it's appealing because it says there's a simple choice, and a bad person made the wrong one. But as you say, the way that Hayes approaches it confounds some of the clarity of that narrative. Undoubtedly, the Republican Party is becoming more and more closely identified with the forces of capital, as they frankly called it in that time period, right? And undoubtedly, that is putting strains upon the ability to hold in any kind of labor coalition in the party, especially as the labor movement becomes more and more identified with immigrants and the children of immigrants. That is always a bad fit with the 19th century Republican Party. So those tensions are clearly there. And yet it's also true in ways that the sort of simple narrative doesn't capture, that Hayes has really mixed feelings about the use of the federal military in the strike, that he orders some of the requests to be sent back because they're not properly done. He's not sort of eager, or he's not sort of priming the pump to say, do this. In fact, some of the requests he gets from states he rejects on the grounds that they're not following proper form. When he does, get it in the form that he believes the Constitution requires from West Virginia, he issues his proclamation exactly on those terms. The Constitution says the president has to receive these requests from the state stating this, and it doesn't have to respond to them, but is obligated to take seriously the idea that this is a valid power the Constitution sets, to use the federal army to help the governor who can't create order. And so Hayes is, in this sense, more guarded, both in that he's reluctant is probably too strong a word, but he's less enthusiastic than the popular narrative sometimes might say, and that he's clearer in this question, and that it's about this sort of constitutional balance and the question of responding to a governor's call for order. In this sense, it's a little different than the use of the army to break up later strikes, some of which occur over the objections of governors, and which really does present a different question of power and authority than 1877 does. But it is a fascinating conjunction, that as these fights over Reconstruction are happening, and this conjunction has led people to wrestle a lot with public opinion about how to understand the relationship between emancipation and rights and other forms of allocation of power in the country.
Very good point. Very good point. Thank you. Thank you so much. I do want to end with one question, and this is a question that's kind of been the theme as we've gone through this series. As presidential sites, we all are dealing at times with a very uncomfortable subjects, and that is about race and how the presidents handled the different racial policies that came before them. So, Dustin, I want to ask you, have you seen more interest at the Hayes Presidential Library on this topic in the last, let's say, 5 to 6 years? Are you seeing a change in the way you talk about that, or a change in your interpretation? What's happening there?
Well, I mean, we're constantly changing the way that we talk about it, simply because we learn more, right? We study it more, we research it more, and the perhaps the easier ways, the more simplistic ways we looked at it earlier are being complicated by our own research. Of course, reading things by Professor Downs has informed me a lot, especially after Appomattox, which completely revolutionized my way of looking at all of this. Not to plug your books, Professor Downs, but nonetheless, I think that's part of it, learning more. I think it's also, we try to focus on not leading anyone to any sort of conclusions, simply being upfront that there are different ways of interpreting this, and there are misperceptions in the general public that, of course, we want to address those things, but we don't necessarily want to then have you leave this place and talk about, oh, well, Hayes is way better than he's been depicted. That's for you to decide. But I think what's really changed since 2020 is the way that the things we emphasize. Before we talked a lot about the way that the general public seems to confuse all those things we talked about at the beginning of this talk with Jim Crow laws, et cetera. Now I think what I like visitors to walk away with is that here we had a real potential problem in our democracy. And despite all of the things that are going on in the background, and maybe, we joked earlier about how Tilden, he probably didn't have the fight in him anyway. But I think regardless, both of these men, regardless of what the outcome would have been from the Electoral Commission, both men would have stepped aside. And I think they would have allowed them the decision to be more important than their desires and their ambitions. And so I think that's more of the narrative that we like to point out now, that it requires that sort of collegiality, that sort of willingness to accept failure that keeps the democracy afloat. And I feel like that's really come out, of course, since 2020, and we really want to push that narrative.
Great, thank you. I think you are exactly right in that. What is our role as presidential libraries? And that's something that, we often talk about as we, talk. And I know I talked with Christy, the president at Hayes, just less than a month ago, when we talked about the fact that, we're often seen as a shrine, and that's not our job. We're here to talk and to give as much information so that our visitors can make their own educated decision on how to see any variety of subjects. So I do want to apologize for going over a little bit. We just a fascinating conversation. I think we could have probably set aside easily 2 hours for this. And so I apologize for going over a little bit. I do want to encourage everyone to go to the website presidentsandrace.org. That's all one word. There you will find some wonderful in-depth resources. I know Dustin has written several of those that you'll find on the Hayes site. We also have recordings from previous sessions in the series, as well as other in-depth resources that you will find from the various presidential sites that we've partnered with in this program. The program series will continue next month. We will have a conversation on President Benjamin Harrison. The program will be held Thursday, May 12th at 7 p.m., 6 p.m. Central. Please go to presidentsandrace.org to register. I do want to thank our panelists for being with us this evening. We really appreciate you spending your time with us and answering questions from our viewers. We look forward to seeing all of our viewers next month. And on behalf of all of us at the Woodrow Wilson Presidential Library, we hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you.